Welcome to the CDN Women in Leadership podcast. My name is Valerie Jackman. I'm the leadership lead at CDN.
And my name is Joanna Campbell, Principal and Chief Exec of Dumfries and Galloway College.
So the podcast is designed for women who are working in education and aspire to progress their career to the next level. The podcast focuses on what women can do and how they can leverage their strengths to advance and thrive in their career.
Today we'll be exploring the topic of breaking the glass ceiling and tackling gender bias, and I'm delighted to welcome our guest, Sara Thiam, who is the Chief Exec for SCDI. Welcome, Sara. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me along. Delighted to be here.
So, Sara, could you perhaps start by telling us about your own leadership journey to where you are now in your current role?
Thank you. And yeah, delighted to be here, as I've said. So in reflecting on this, I've been working for 40 years. It occurred to me today. So it's a very long journey. But I think there are some common threads and some lessons from having worked across different sectors. I'm very much a generalist. So I've worked across different sectors, public, private, not-for-profit, and with education, although not directly in educational institutions. And so I think there's a number of things probably that I want to pick up on in telling you my story. But I think the first of those is purpose, and actually believing in what you do, I think is something that's always been really important to me. I really need to believe in what I do and care about what the organisation is doing. I talked about being a generalist, but I think for me, there's also a real value in bringing different sectors and different people together. You can see that in working in teams, can't you? But that diversity of people and sectors is really important if you're going to get any kind of innovation or new thinking, and having people that aren't just, thinking like you or in your own model. So that sort of whole being better than the sum of the parts. The other thing I would say is staying curious, learning throughout your life. You learn in every single job whether you're working in a pub or in a frontline service, or there's things that you learn everywhere, isn't there, about people and about organizations. And then I think the final thing for me is really about being lucky. uh, you know, Good old Scots mother, that sort of well-known phrase of what's for you will not go past you. So there is a degree of luck, but actually you can shape your own luck. I mean, there's that line about the harder you work, the luckier you get. But I think also in terms of luck, I do need to check my privilege as well. I've been lucky to work with some great bosses and great people who I've learnt a lot from, and people giving me a chance and taking a punt on me. So I think there's a lesson for us as leaders in that. And then finally, that authenticity, the importance of identity, of who you are, where you come from, and what that actually means. But I think also in terms of being lucky, I come back to checking my privilege and to the best start in life, which is your home life. I think your working life starts in the home, doesn't it? So the importance of home and family is my first kind of thing that I would talk about. So I had two parents. So, again, in the race of life, you're starting in a good place, having two adults that care about you and an extended family. Both worked. My mother was a working mother, and I think that had an impact as well. My father was a small businessman, and my mum was a primary school teacher. But that importance of work was impressed on me from an early age. And in terms of my values about working hard, trying your best, turning up, sticking at things, old-fashioned, but I think those things stick with you through life. And then the importance of fun in your social life. I was from a fairly big family of four. Busy house, folk were always in and out. There was always something going on. So that sort of wider societal piece. And I think actually, in terms of how you behave as a leader, I think actually having those social skills And part of that's about your family and home life. And having things that matter outside of your work, passions. It's going out for a walk, climbing hills, reading books, going to the theatre, whatever it is, hang on to those things because you really need them. And my goodness, we've had to be resilient, haven't we, in the last few years? So actually, that hinterland matters. Um, so I'm happy to keep talking if you like, but sort of just talk you through all the different things I've done in my 40 years.
That's been fabulous, Sarah. And actually, you spoke about purpose, you spoke about luck, and also similar to one of our other guests, you spoke about the importance your upbringing had on developing that leadership mindset and the role models that you had in your parents as well. And that's a theme that's come through with other guests as well.
Great. So in terms of the jobs I've had, first thing was Saturday job. I started at 15 in a local baker's shop, 8 o'clock shift Saturday morning. I've worked in pubs, I've done all of that stuff. I worked all the way through university, restaurants, pubs, retail, you name it. At a time actually when not everybody did, but I like spending money, so I have to make it. I'm afraid. But I think that the value of working before you start a kind of on a formal career path is you learn a lot of transferable skills from that. So those jobs matter, and they're just as important. Um, my brother and I were the first generation in our family to go to university. I did a languages degree, which probably automatically meant that I had an interest in travelling. So that international outlook and getting out of Scotland was early on really important for me. What was it about a small town girl, 17-year-old, that made me take the train to Paris when I was 17 and be an au pair for 3 months before I went to university? Who knows? The fact that I was gallus enough to do it, I still can't quite believe today. But there was something about, maybe it's about being a small town girl, that actually you want to explore the world out there. Um, so after university, so I had a year abroad as a language assistant in France, but I also then taught in Quebec for a year after graduating. So I did have a gap year, but I wasn't bumming around. I was actually working, and I was working teaching English. But you just learn so much from that all that life experience. I think this is where our young people have had such a tough time during the pandemic. 3 years of your life at those critical stages of having a horrible landlord, dealing with a difficult boss, finding somewhere to live, getting on with your flatmates. All that life experience is just so valuable, and lots of our young folk have missed out on that. So we need to cut them a bit of slack. And I was in a member of ours yesterday, Deloitte, who were talking about their young workers being lonely and feeling isolated. So I think there's something to be thinking about there. So thereafter, I went to London. I worked in market research for a couple of years. Then in the private sector, because I was a languages graduate, doing market studies in Europe and France primarily, which was my language, French, sort of looking at mergers and acquisitions, doing market studies. So a bit of industrial espionage, really, and working for industrial clients, actually looking to start exporting, trade associations, anything from garage doors to plaster, to plasterboard to, very much that kind of stuff. So really, really interesting. I then went into Quangoland for 10 years. I worked, because of, again, my languages background and that private sector background, I joined the British Council, who were running all the European exchange programmes, and worked on the UK Lingua programme, which was about encouraging language learning. Probably more important for young people in the UK than anywhere else in Europe. And then from that, came back to Scotland pretty early on in my 20s, and came back to Community Learning Scotland, which was a non-departmental public body, but staffed by the most extraordinary and brilliant people in the sort of non-formal education sector. So youth work, adult education, community learning and development, and learned so much from people there. I worked on Eurodesk and International, and Louise MacDonald, who is now the DG Economy in Scottish Government, ran the youth work side of things. But Louise and I both benefited from having phenomenal leaders. And I think because it was about community learning and development, that empowerment of young people, because they were youth workers, we as young women were given real opportunities to take projects and run with them. So I was there, that's where the luck comes in. I then went to local government for 10 years. I joined Edinburgh Council, and I did lots of European knowledge transfer projects. All of these projects were about Scotland being the best it could be. It was about learning from other European countries, whether that be about developing our waterfronts, whether it be about thinking about citizen participation in government. It was always about connecting local authority staff with their opposite numbers in the EU and learning from the different approaches they'd taken to similar challenges, participation in elections, getting the public involved in local government, the tier of government closest to them, whether it was about looking at regeneration or infrastructure or place. There was lots to be learned from our European partners. I then moved into a professional body, which was about civil engineers and infrastructure and professional qualification. And that brought public, private, and third sector together. So 10 years roughly in non-departmental public bodies, 10 years in local government, 10 years in a professional body. And then my most recent job, which brought me to Scottish Council for Development and Industry, which brings all of those together: public, private, academia, public benefit, not-for-profit organisations.
Brilliant. So you've had a very varied career, Sarah. That's really interesting.
Very, and one where, as I say, as a generalist, I've had the opportunity to kind of look over the wall and learn about different sectors and different cultures and how people do things differently. So from that kind of youth work, community development, community education beginning, to business and leadership, and also, interestingly, working in a professional body. This was the professional body for civil engineers, people that design, build, and maintain, the most vital infrastructure, from your water supply to your motorways, to bridges, to those connections. And actually, often the professional body I worked for, there had been a series of director generals who'd come in from army backgrounds. Huge amount to learn from army people as well. Phenomenal at getting things done, but actually also empowering, and empowering their staff. And I was the regional director for Scotland, and my DG was very much about, well, that's your patch. You tell me what the key issues are. Come to me if you need help, but I'll give you air cover. That's your patch. I'll support you. I'll develop you where you need developed, but I want you to run the show there. And I trust your judgment.
Yeah.
And that's very empowering, I think.
Absolutely.
Lots to learn from that too.
Great. So, Sarah, as we mentioned, the topic today is breaking the glass ceiling. And as women, we're very familiar with that term, which of course refers to the way some groups of women or people, not just women, are held back in their careers. In our discussion today, in this podcast, we're focusing in on women. And so therefore, what I was going to ask you was, do you think enough has been done in organisations today to tackle this from a female perspective?
Well, in reflecting on this, I probably want to quote Mark Logan. Mark Logan put a great post on LinkedIn the other day. Mark Logan, as you'll know, is the chief entrepreneur for Scotland and has been leading some really interesting work in tech, but also is a terrific ally I think. So his quote is around women don't need fixed, they aren't broken. Society and organisations, on the other hand, have work to do. I've worked in very male-dominated sectors. So infrastructure, construction, built environment, engineering and place, where I was at the Institution of Civil Engineers, very male-dominated industry. And to this day, some of the sectors I work with, oil and gas, still pretty blokey. So I think my first takeaway here is men as allies, and Mark is indeed one of those allies. But I'm also very mindful about questions of intersectionality. My husband is from West Africa, and my daughters are mixed race, mixed heritage, and so I'm much more aware. I'm aware of some of the challenges and barriers facing them, and facing some of our sisters. So actually, I think we in turn must be allies. So men as allies, but women need to be allies as well. So I've had, I talked about being lucky. I talked about having a good start in life. So actually, I need to be an ally to women who face even more barriers than I have done. So that's my first kind of takeaway. And Mark was using that quote in connection with a new report, which is a review about a new approach for women in entrepreneurship by Anna Stewart and Mark Logan, which really is kind of lifted the veil on only 1 in 5 of today's entrepreneurs being women. Which is, of course, a huge removal of talent from our entrepreneurial ecosystem, and an industrial scale denial of individual opportunity. But I think the lessons that are coming out of that actually apply to business, and society more generally. So my second takeaway would be about start early, start in the cradle. So one of the points this report is making about relative to men, women are often more logistically constrained. I think that's a wonderful expression. Talking about really our kind of caring responsibilities, and being the primary care role and so on, in the home manager role in many cases, but society not providing sufficient balancing support. So, we've been reflecting on our First Minister and some of the really positive things she's done. And I think that childcare provision, the baby box, all of those kind of things, which brings me on to my next kind of takeaway, which is about, starting in the cradle, with all of this stuff. I think it's, start that right from birth. The next thing is getting over our imposter syndrome. The other thing this report's saying is that women not have a sense of not belonging, in entrepreneurship, which affects their confidence and self-belief. We have to get over that, feel the fear and do it anyway. We all have it. Build your network would be my other takeaway, because the other point in this report is about the, informal pathways and networking, but quite often underserving women, something I perceive in my working life. I have lots of opportunities given the sort of job I'm in, to go along to corporate events, whether that be rugby or football or golf. I am very struck at the extent to which those sporting events are still very male dominated.
Mm-hmm.
I'm afraid, and the golf and football stuff, yeah, I have a bit of a problem with, I have to say. So women really have to kind of build their own networks, but not exclusively, not women only, but yeah, finding their allies and having those broader networking. And I think organizations like ours are organizations that can help with that kind of networking. And actually, if I have any kind of network at all, it's because of SCDI, which I was a member of for many years before I came to work there.
It's really interesting listening to your journey, and some of the things you've spoken about just now in terms of allyship and networking. They've come up in the previous podcasts. How important they are for women, not just to have a sisterhood, but to have that wider, as you say, allyship and those wider networks. I've also been in the workplace for many decades. And I had an experience when I was thinking and preparing for this podcast. I had an experience where I worked with one of the large banks in Scotland, and I went on maternity leave to have my first son. And I had been progressing and sort of on a trajectory and a high performer, or perceived to be one. But when I came back, one of the managers said to me, "Well, we know where your priorities lie now." And I remember being so shocked, and I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, clearly, you'll need to give a lot of your time and attention to your family and to your child. So, you really need to think about, what does your career now mean for you?" And I was really shocked at that. Thankfully, I think if anybody did that now, there's legislation that would protect you against that. Because I could go into the more detail on the conversation, but I won't. But it really was. I mean, it was as if his mind had been made up that I had chosen to have family, rather than really vigorously pursue a career. But have you yourself ever experienced, or even yourself, Joanna, have you ever come to that glass ceiling place?
Well, I mean, there have been occasions where, certainly I found myself in situations where perhaps I have been capable of doing the role, but it has been, given to a man for a whole variety of reasons, because perhaps the organisation wanted to preserve the status quo. That would be my perception on that. But early on in my career, and I'm always ashamed to admit this, but early on in my career, nobody asked if I had family, and I wouldn't volunteer that information because I did not want to be judged.
Yeah.
And that's quite shameful to say that. Would I do that now? No, definitely not. I think society has moved on. I mean, and I'm not old as such, so I'm not talking about a very long time ago here. I'm talking quite recently,
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that is so, yeah, it's actually one of my takeaways, because I was, things have changed, fortunately. We now have, a young woman who's thrown her hat in the ring to be First Minister with a young baby,
Yeah.
so that's really made me reflect about it. But things have really changed, in terms of aspiring future female leaders to navigate their way around gender bias or discrimination. In my early career, like you, Joanna, I'm pretty ashamed that I felt the need to hide or suppress my caring commitments. I turned myself inside out to find strategies to form alliances with, friends, other mums, other dads, around school pickups, around, who's doing it this week, and oh, I've got a work thing I have to be at. Then can we? Because really you sort of felt you wouldn't be taken seriously. I'm also kind of remember as a young woman, an older woman talking a lot and quite openly about her menopause long before the days where we were encouraged to do so. And as a young woman, me kind of thinking, oh, really, if I was her, I'd be keeping quiet about that. So, thinking has evolved and thankfully, but I would encourage young women to think about it as a superpower. That kind of those strategies that we've got for managing our working and caring commitments. It's a superpower. It's a transferable skill. Bringing up kids teaches you a lot about people and personalities, and it gives you wisdom. And it also gives you strategies for dealing with difficult individuals, actually dealing with toddlers and recalcitrant middle-aged men is not wildly different in terms of a skill set, I would argue. So pick your battles,
Yeah.
work around the difficult individuals, learn to disagree well, keep your eye on the longer term win, be strategic, and try not to let them get to you. There are still some of them around, but let's just work around them, because sometimes we're not going to come out of it better. It depends. At the same time, if you're in a position where you have the power to do something about it, and call out a bad behavior, or something that's if you're managing people that are exhibiting these kind of tendencies, you're in a bit more of a powerful situation to do something about it. But yeah, that would be my kind of take on that one.
Yeah. And you've given quite a few tips for how people might sort of navigate their way around, whether it's gender bias or discrimination generally, in terms of, you've suggested people build an allyship and create a network. What else would you suggest for people, or what else would you recommend that people do?
Keep yourself informed. Take an interest in what's going on around you. Take a broader view and a longer view. See the bigger picture. One of the kind of threads that's really run through my career. I'm really passionate about Scotland. I love my own country, but I think we have to be honest with ourselves and hold a mirror up to ourselves and recognise where we are genuinely world leading, and where there is work to be done and where we need to be better, and keep our eyes open and our ears open and learn about who are the smart people, who are doing the exciting things, where's the competition at. So yes, I'm passionate about our country, but that mustn't make us blind to what our weaknesses are and how we need to get better. So retaining that outward focus would be my first takeaway. I think the second one, and we've picked up on it earlier, but build your network. But to extend on that, I would say surround yourself with positive people who are interested in doing things and getting things done. The glass half full people rather than the glass half empty people. There's a brilliant book that's just been brought out actually about, kind of teaching yourself to be an optimist. Actually, I think Chris Stark is one of those people who the chief exec of the Committee on Climate Change, and a Scot, working in a broader, in a wider UK role, in a really vital role for all of us. Chris is great in terms of taking that. Yes, things are really bad in terms of net zero, but we have the solutions. We can do this. I think it's that, let's recognize what we can do. Because actually there's a lot of evidence that people that are optimistic or try to be optimistic will actually try and do something about things. So do your best, keep trying. And then the final thing would just be stay true to your values, to what you believe in.
And actually, Sarah, you touched on a couple of really good points there. I was just wanting to tease them out a wee bit. And actually, if you've not watched it, I'm sure you have, but Sheryl Sandberg's TED Talk in 2010, which was obviously 13 years ago now, but a lot of what you're saying, she actually emphasizes in that TED Talk and actually features in her very famous book, Lean In, as well. So a lot resonates with that. So moving on, what I was going to ask you then, Sarah, was what advice would you have given your 16-year-old self, knowing all of this and all the vast experience that you've had in the workplace? What would you tell your 16-year-old self if you could go back?
Gosh, well, because I have daughters, and daughters who are at the sort of early stages of career ladders, believe in yourself. I think the thing that really saddens me most is that, when you're a young person, you don't necessarily believe in yourself or know your worth. So actually knowing your own value, and being bold enough to actually question um, those further up the hierarchy from you, in a positive and constructive way, but also always try to engage positively. If you don't, it's one of the wonderful things. It's one of the things I really love about our members at SCDI, and I think that's what the differentiator is. The difference between our members is actually they are the organisations, they are the people that are building a better Scotland, that do want to do something about the perceived challenges that we face as a society, and we'll get on with it. But they engage constructively. So it isn't just about calling out what's wrong or what's bad, but it's also about seeing what can be done better, and walking the walk. But yeah, I'd probably, advise myself to believe in myself a bit more.
That's great. And actually, that self-belief aspect that you spoke about there, that's come up time and time again. And again, referring back to Sheryl Sandberg, she talks about sitting at the table. And actually, women lack confidence, whereas men inherently, I think, have, or I'm making a sweeping statement here, and I don't mean it to apply to everybody, but in general, they have a lot of confidence, a lot of self-confidence. So there's something in the self-belief term that
some do,
you
some don't. And I think, I was talking earlier about how our young people have suffered, and I think our young men have suffered in a way, actually, and things are getting better about people talking about their mental health. But I think our young men are having a tough time. I don't have boys, but I see my nephews, and I suppose that informs how I think about these things, because actually I can see the young men in my own family maybe not believing themselves as much as they should. But yeah, I think the network thing's important, but positive networks. I think, again, SCDI has been a lifelong friend to me in many ways before I came to work here. And what I really loved about it was coming along to that first forum, was that I was welcomed in, and I was welcomed in by older, much more important, much cleverer, much more senior people than me. But what I loved about it was that these were people that cared about Scotland. And as long as I was coming along on the basis that I shared their value about wanting to make Scotland a better place, their attitude was, well, come and join the party.
Yeah.
We'd like to know what you think. You're younger than us. You have a different perspective. You're just a fourth tier local government officer. But, even if I'm a senior person in the bank, or a local authority chief executive, or a Sir Kenneth Calman, I mean, that was the wonderful thing about Forum. One year I was sitting next to Sir Kenneth Calman, and I was like just this wee, fourth tier local government. But he was so delightful and so welcoming, and actually really good leaders.
Yeah.
That's what they're like. They value everybody equally, from the bottom of their organisation to their most senior people, because everybody's got something to bring.
Yeah, and it's about that, creating that culture, isn't it? And SCDI is a wonderful networking opportunity, and I would encourage anybody, whether they're male, female, who in any walk of life, to get involved in SCDI. And certainly from my own personal experience, I have benefited hugely from connecting up with some of the people that I've met by being involved in SCDI. So yeah, brilliant.
So that brings us to the end of today's episode, and a big thank you to Sara Thiam for joining us and sharing your really interesting journey that incorporated so many different roles in so many different sectors, and also for sharing your wisdom and the tips that you have to encourage people so that they can build their networks and that they can thrive better in the workplace. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you for having me.